Hello everyone, today we talk about knighthood and more specifically of the frame that the ecclesiastical historiography in certain regions, especially of Central Europe, gave to the knights. And now we will see what we mean here with the Miles, with the chevalier, because this is an analysis essentially of the terminology of the knight and how it was defined politically and socially speaking at the time. And more specifically in the 10th century, so in a phase of transition that was very peculiar, as you know, because it's the moment for which we can start talking more, properly of the creation of a military class proper, right? That is very loose and that is very difficult, in fact, to describe, to define, to frame, because all over post-Carolingian Europe at this point, knighthood took kind of different shapes and shades, right? Not all European knights were alike especially in terms of socioeconomical status, sometimes even of juridical status, right? There is not a way to define a knight at this point, but through the idea of a elite horseman, right? That is becoming slowly to be such, right? But the terminology is really wildly different, and it follows a transformation. Just to make an example of what we're talking about, the term miles, right? Miles is a Latin word that is used universally from a certain moment onwards in European history to define the knight, right? And the miles in Latin was substantially a civic servant, fundamentally. He was literally the guy who was given a salary, right? Originally, some grain, hence also the word the miles actually stems from etymologically speaking, since the siege of Veii, right? And that was seen in this regard as a subordinate of public authority, right? It's obvious that from low medieval times, this term changes a big deal. Essentially, the miles becomes a sort of the equivalent of the knight, of course, but in certain areas of Europe, especially in France, where chivalry has the greatest development in the continent, as fundamentally an elite, right? That is distinguished from all the rest of the population, that is the workers. Right, so it's a very sharp divide in this area of Europe where the political and social stratification was very wide. Even within this, this low medieval French context, still the term miles can hide very different social statuses. Like you can be the aristocracy and the knights that served this aristocracy, but still there was a large gap. Right? It was a large social stratification. It is typical of France, right? This place where basically nowhere else. So such an enormous, overwhelming amount of wealth was concentrated in the hands of such few people, right? In all the rest of Europe, in spite, the Frankish model had been exported, basically, post-Carolingian regions, then even beyond with the Normans, and even in surrounding places like the Iberian Peninsula, etc. And in the East, this social divide had not been so intense. We can't say, obviously at this point, this is not a strictly military historical video, right? We don't talk about the technicality of the knight, that actually all across Europe, independently from the background, is fundamentally the same fighter, right? It can have a higher or lesser degree of collective training. Even in here, France pioneers the first, as in fact more wealth was concentrated in the hands of fewer people that could organize more rationally, more systematically this even discipline and training. But the difference is made also, in fact, within the political and institutional frame. Think about the Eastern Frankish Kingdom and the development of the ministeriales. We made a video actually recently about the Flemish Lorrainese ministeriales in the 10th, 11th century that deals partly what we will have to deal here. The point though we want to see today is how, and I didn't complete the point, that is that with the elevation, let's say, of the military class properly meant in the lower Middle Ages, there is a coincidence that in the French-speaking world can be easily observed between the miles and the chevalier, right? And the point is very different, because chevalier is semantically a very different thing from the miles, right? As we have seen, the miles is technically the servant. The chevalier is nothing but a positive term that looks at the guys who could afford essentially a war horse, right? And that therefore were extremely privileged and very wealthy in their own regard, even when they actually served someone else. But the point here is that the miles, as we will see now, was not developing in 10th century Europe towards the servile condition. In certain areas, as we have seen of Germany, the Eastern Frankish Kingdom proper, it was going towards that direction. Even certain areas of the former Lotharingia, etc., where we find the ministeriales, in fact. But the point is that the term miles will lose the synonym of servant and will acquire the significance actually of even a person of higher status, right? If not an aristocrat in some ways, right? But once again, every categorization, it doesn't fit, right? It's primarily a matter of how these guys fought, right? Which naturally implied they were better than the average, socioeconomically speaking, but still the situation could be very varied at other levels. So this era of Central Europe, first of all, the 10th century is the moment in which the situation has still to take shape, right? The Carolingian Empire has fallen since a few time, and as you know, it had been the Carolingians that fundamentally from the early 8th century had intensified a process that actually even in Merovingian France had taken place, that was the one of the intensification of the same social stratification, right? The Carolingians just systematize and basically render it universal in their political and even institutional frame. That is to say that the public authority fundamentally is represented not by a central organism that works with an apparatus, with a civilian character. In the Frankish world, there is no concept of public authority, right? Even when there is it's basically fiction. Everybody thinks, starting from the sovereigns, that basically what they own is a sort of private possession. This is something that began as early as Clovis, basically, because that's how the Frankish kingdom had been created conceptually, with a strongly dynastic mindset. It was copied also by the rest of the aristocracy. So all these lineages, all these powerful families that will emerge as what we think as the feudal elite, right? Eventually, is really framed in this mindset, and they are the guys who own the political, military, and social power. So the reality is that there is this body that controls the society tout court, except in part for the ecclesiastical world, that is actually not very different from it, because the great part of the ecclesiastical principalities basically shared the same identical culture, right? In many levels, and also because they were part of the same families, and naturally there is this overwhelming mass of workers that is subordinated to this elite. So a lot of things happen after the Carolingian Empire in defining, especially from the bottom of society sometimes, this new military class that emerges sometimes effectively from non-elite, right? And this is particularly evident in the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, let's say the far you get in Central Europe from the cradle of the Frankish world proper, and especially in Germany because it's poorer and much less socially stratified. And as we have seen in those other videos on the ministeriales, essentially in those Central European areas, there is a sort of artificial creation of the military class that in this wanted and expressed creation, the knights are non-freemen, right? So while in the Western Frankish kingdom, for example, in spite of the pulverization of monarchic authority, actually even more than in Germany, because Germany is the place in here where, after all, the Frankish legacy in terms of monarchic and imperial authority in the 10th century is rebuilt from, right, which is paradoxical, but still very significant in ways that we can't explain now. Maybe if you look at the Ottonian Germany playlist, maybe you get a bit better, but there are other parallelisms. Look at also what the Normans that were capable to do in England, in Sicily. But the point here is that in France, that there was no need to create a military class ex novo. Why? Because basically Gaul had always been like that. I mean, since late Roman times, the area had pullulated with this petty lords that, however, made up their own, retinues. They had a great power. Sometimes, just to make a proportion, a normal proteress from Gaul in, I don't know, Merovingian times was privately richer than the Longobard king in Italy, for example, because they had these huge private assets. Naturally, that's the reason why the Merovingian kingdom had collapsed. I mean, by the end of the 7th century, you can't even technically talk about a unique kingdom. France is a sort of, Francia, let's say better, is this sort of 4 split kingdoms, etc. The Carolingians are the ones that robust this, centralized push and re-expand towards the outside, basically recramble inside, because they hadn't changed the essentials of how that thing had worked. But in France, you don't have to create your own military class, because it's plenty of people out there that you can already frame within this relation between the land and a huge amount of land, the one that it's necessary to maintain a war horse, it's in training with it, and an armor, right? And we're talking about enormous expanses for even for high medieval society. Right, it's like if you have that, it's as if you had a private jet, right? So that there are this single guy and tons of people, hundreds of people, basically break their backs in the fields for all their lives just to maintain this guy, right? That contrarily to classist interpretations, is actually truly their protector. This guy doesn't treasure wealth just to leave on the backs of. He actually doesn't even treasure. This wealth. He constantly reinvests it on the territory, and that's how the seigneurial system spread. That's how Europe was rebuilt from the bottom, right? It gave jobs to people, it built mills, it maintained roads, bridges, and restructured this European pulverized space from a political point of view to recompact around the seigneuries, right? And in Germany, it wasn't like that. Germany had been largely, especially the north, conquered ex novo by the Franks, right? Had been populated essentially by tribes that had a minimal transformation over time, but that weren't neither remotely close to what happened just a few hundred kilometers away. And the problem here was to actually create a military class properly meant, as it was in France, because the local communities actually were quite active from a military point of view, in the sense that the village, the local community, had its own militia, had their own kind of autonomistic spirit that had been hardly broken by the Francization of the territory. So very often the lords, if they wanted to rule in here, they basically assumed people who were outcast from society, that were, however, framed with different degrees, even of freedom, actually, because even in Germany, of course, there were the free knights, right? But it takes place this kind of lower class of people that basically begin to survive, consider the crisis that strikes. I mean, the hungers that pillage all of Germany, put everything on fire and destroy it. It's a dreadful moment, right? It hadn't been an easy. I mean, already the Frankish conquest had been pretty tough. Then think about the Slavic frontier, or these peoples from Central Europe. Even the Saracens reached the upper Rhine Valley. I mean, there are these things that, in the 10th century, we call it the Iron Century for a reason. And this naturally had damaged the social balance. The same Frankish formula, the vassalitic beneficiary system, had brought in this impoverishment, fundamentally, of the average freeman in favor of these lords, that actually even the local aristocracies were pretty happy to to render their fellow countrymen poorer, to rule over them, right? And in this and for some it was very convenient actually to become, even as non-juridical freemen, and there were many in Germany, because these were places where there was slavery, and the thing had always been like that. There was actually an enormous contempt towards slaves. But rather with with this emphasis that existed between the freemen, right, in an egalitarian sense that was somewhat, ideal, because naturally Germany, even before the full Carolingian conquest, was stratified. I mean, there was an elite, and the idea of freedom was actually shared by these people that already ruled over, abusing and oppressing their own way, but also protecting. So I always consider the other side of the story, especially in a moment in which really the hungers can come from everywhere, and you need someone that protects you. This was a huge deal. Much of this process was actually even consensual, right? People were willing to hand their part of, or their freedom to in exchange for military protection, right? And that's what seigneurial Europe develops like. And naturally, they're not ever completely devoid of any kind of freedom. They still have their own dynamism, after all. But there is the development of a class of ministeriales that, in this regard, are not the chevalier as such, right? Are not the freemen that consensually go fighting, in the clientele of a lord of the eldermen, right? Of the dominus, meant as the old guy that gives us the boss, right? That gives us job. This is the mob. Consider seigneurial Europe is not like the mob. It is the mob by definition, right? It works in the same exact way. I mean, before the modern state, there is no other system but mafia. Tributes are hush money by definition. All this ostentation of wealth, familial ties. It's the same identical thing, and it's all functional to this system, right? This is not a moral choice. If you didn't work like that, you died, or you ended up breaking your back in those fields to maintain someone else. And it was a radically violent world, and especially in these areas, especially at the borders of the Carolingian, world, of these areas of frontier. The Eastern Frankish Kingdom especially didn't practically have a border, especially in the eastern area, where these areas remained fluid for centuries and centuries. They were very unstable areas with fragile political and institutional entities. So the ministerialis, in this regard, is much more akin to the miles, because he's effectively a servant, right? He's a guy who's receiving a pay for doing in exchange for something, right? He's not a freeman. Juridically, the fact, right? He may even be more powerful than a freeman. Ask the ministerialis of, 13th century Germany, that were even richer sometimes, of the local nobility. But in the 10th century, this is even more evident, because these are actually poor people, right? There are some, perhaps, and that's why I also mentioned that video about the Flemish and Lorrainese ministeriales, because we addressed those topics there. Is that initially they were even probably less in terms of military equipment and even experience than their free counterparts, then the gap is bridged very, very fast, very quickly. There is basically no difference from a certain time onwards, right? And this naturally depends on many factors. So the different levels of conditions, because also the freemen, the serfs in this regard could contract. They had their own autonomy, saying, at which condition do I remain a serf? Because literally, this was also an individual choice sometimes. It was not imposed all the time. And it was even more advantageous, as we've seen, to many freemen careers, right? So in this area, there is a greater permanence, a greater ambiguity, historically speaking, in the sources for a long time, in fact, because consider that ministeriales disappear in Germany from basically by the 14th century, right? By the 14th century, it's a distinction that doesn't make sense. They become knights in their own regard. But here we're talking about, almost half of a millennium in which this thing had defined the Eastern Frankish knighthood proper, most of the cases. So the question is also, if in France that our ideal is that the miles is a knight, right? The knights are the milites. There is this quite clear idea of who a knight is, right? Also in terms of life, of status, of lifestyle, etc. What about the origins, the 10th century? Well, the origins can be even shifted by the 9th, the 8th, but in the 10th century, where we can more easily define in Europe, this class that emerges in the absence, or at least in the great weakness of central authority as the effective ruling class at a local level. How was this true at this moment and in these areas of the East, the Eastern Frankish world, where the thing was, still in a somewhat embryonal stage, right? The whole thing of chivalry as a whole. And this is a question, at which point the miles were intended by the men and the sources of the time, which is also a very different thing, right? Because the sources are usually ecclesiastical at this point. We don't know, a secular lord would think of it more than a clerk would. Let's say since the 10th century would indicate what the values even that would eventually be designated by the French word chevalier. And the answer to this question is not easy, because actually different studies have, and sometimes on single authors that we will partially see now, have wrote to the most articulated results, right? For example, for Richet of Saint-Rémi, that was, by the way, a French historian that also came from a noble family at the service of Louis the IV of France, so in a very different context to the one we're focusing today. He could, answer to the question by spotting at least three distinct categories of concepts, right? For one side, it was the purely military one, right? That is the guy who fights, essentially. Then the vassalatic one, that is, this guy is he who fundamentally serves, who has received a benefit from a lord and is administrating it in his behalf, right? And finally, that more shaded, that designed warriors, let's say, of superior condition to the one of the simple armed men that could be even the local militias or things like these, but that were still and always strictly dependent on a lord and in turn protected by him, right? That is, guards / serfs of some sort, right? Which is the military retinue, what would have been known as the masnata eventually, right? And that is somewhat even the most typical, picture of the miles meant as a fighter, right? As the chevalier also on the field. That is, for this author, for example, for Richet, it's extremely clear that the milites as a group are decisively of inferior condition to another group that he designates as the principes or magnates, right? That are naturally the princes or the magnates. So people were maybe they're actually fighting in the same way as the knights do. They share the same culture, the same military ethos, the same ideals, the same values, but they are identified in terms of political and social status by the fact that they're very wealthy, very powerful, and they actually hire and use and protect their own knights as such, as we have seen. So at this point, we are in the 10th century, and still in an area that was very developed in the sense of the positive semantic definition of the miles as more than a servant, right? But the semantic stigma, let's say, indicating the subordination and service, remained attached to the word miles, even in this case, right? And in the same France, in fact, still for a consistent part of the 11th century, and in Lorraine and in Germany, even as we have seen, up to the 12th and the 13th, the sources distinguish between the Milites and the great nobles, called, in fact, as we have seen, principes, magnates, also proceres, as we were saying before, or optimates, right? That of course were also different in their own regard, but they essentially mean here that this high, nobility, or at least very, very powerful, very rich people, right? Because considering here that in post-Carolingian societies, literally the seigneurial institution developed sometimes even from people that were not coming from a noble lineage, right? They were maybe merchants that made a freaking lot of money, and they start building their own castle and having their own military retinues, and they de facto became lords, right? So there were important, fascinating differences also in this regard. So this condition of hierarchical inferiority, together with the gregarian function carried out by the milites towards the seniores, that is the lords, right, and the practical interchangeability of the terms miles and bassus, had conceptually to tie strictly the figure of the miles to a subordinate relation that was expressed sometimes even by the locution militare aliqui, right? That means to serve militarily for someone, practically under someone, and that it's an expression that has also caused a lot of misunderstandings sometimes. Why? Because we have to look at the sources that use this terminology, right? As we were saying before, the source is not the entire world here, and that's why today we concentrate on the ecclesiastical point of view, because this is the one that still had, say, more ideological interests to frame the knights in a specific context, status, and social position. This idea, especially, this created problems to historians that started believing, reading these sources, that the knight at some point in this early phase had to be forcefully framed in a sort of chain of dependency, right? That had to be someone's knight, right? As a possession, right? A bit like the ministerialis actually was, but just in a part of the broader, of the much larger post-Carolingian world. And by the 10th century, actually, this definition is the closest to the truth, though, right? Even in France, as we have seen, there was a definite idea that there was at least a differentiation between the nobility, let's call it in this way, the powerful, and this much larger, of course, properly class, as we will see now, of knights, right? A knighthood or a knightly class, social level, even that included even the families sometimes. Later on, this would have not been the case, especially in France. But the point that we want to stress here is that the concept of miles, right? After all, right, on the conceptual level, and also the derived terms like militare or militia, express all equality, right? Not a relation man to man, right? It is true that the milis is he who receives a pay and therefore is depending on this profession, right? It has a markedly professional idea. But the term itself, even in Latin, has nothing to do with a social and juridical subordination, right? On the contrary, in Latin, the miles was the Roman soldier slash citizen, so he who was fully freeman, right? And it was a privilege in this sense. It has started receiving a pay for his military service. That was a service slash duty slash privilege in that condition. And partly this overlapped actually on the even the social reality of the 10th century for many people, right? The Milites weren't, as we will see now, just all serfs or necessarily, depending from a strictly juridical point of view. They were contractors, rather, right? The senior, for example, that had spoken of his own, let's say, miles, would have intended to show in that sense rather the type of service that by him was provided to the man, without including within this necessarily, at least, the idea of subordination that his own milites owed to him as milites themselves, right? Duby makes this very effective parallelism by writing comme il dit les cas échéants mon clair sans que nul n'ait jamais supposé que les termes clericus emportent avec lui l'idée d'un dévouement à un homme. Right? It's the same thing. I mean, the idea that if we talk about my clerk, think about all the clerks that served under the monarchy, right? At this point, already, the king might have said, "This is my clerk, right? My clergyman." But the concept of cleric, and that was definitely tied by a clientele of some sort, because the monastery maybe depended on the king, the nation. There was all this deep intertwine. But the term clericus in Latin, as Duby writes here, that doesn't imply the idea of the devotion to a man. The clergyman is devoted to Christ, and that's it, right? And actually, the ecclesiastical dimension is actually detached from, I mean, essentially, even if it operates in the world, from the world per se, right? That's also why, in parallel, the ecclesiastical sources tend also to frame the milites in a different picture that's sometimes more ideal, sometimes even more elaborated conceptually, but still not necessarily overlapping with the reality of the time. The use of the word miles with this annexed subordinative content was maintained, in fact, especially in the ecclesiological literature, right? Which is obvious if you think of this broader anthropological and social meditation that was carried out by the clergy at the time, that tended to fix a hierarchy of social values, essentially, that were developed within this literature at the time. To explain briefly why this happened, we also have to consider the I made several videos in Medieval Christianity playlist in explaining the role of monasteries, of the church broadly meant, let's say, in post-Carolingian Europe, like this idea of a connective tissue of European culture, right? What the only thing that actually remained standing from Carolingian times, hyper-connected, prolific, and kind of strengthening itself in this time, in spite of the distractions. Think about the Viking, the Saracen, and Hunger raids that targeted specifically the ecclesiastical centers, but that bloomed in this sense and was also instrumentally employed, in fact, by the monarchies to boost their own ideological legitimization this time. Is in fact the church, the one of the church, and the realization that there was a duty of the church as well that went beyond the mere spiritual side of the story. Part of this it's caused culturally by the fact that, as we've seen before, many clergymen were actually coming from the nobility, right? The church, especially in the early Middle Ages, was always very, let's say, meritocratic in many ways. I mean, if you were an intelligent person who displayed some intellectual capacity of sort, it was fairly easy to get educated by the clergy and to enter in it, even to make a career from relatively humble conditions. But still, most, and especially in Central Europe, this world was very, very aristocratic in character. That means that actually, and we made about this some video that now I don't remember specifically, the one on Gérard de Aurillac, written by Otto of Cluny, on secular holiness, that basically creates this model of the saint/knight, even, because there was this duplicity. I mean, the great abbots and bishops looked at the knightly class and the nobility, the secular nobility, saying, these are literally our brothers, our families that fight to maintain an order that is all one with also the one of the church, of course, in the Christian world is we're working for. But still, it was a different perspective, right? And there was the attempt, naturally, even to stamp the massive violence, naturally, that came from these classes that were they were actually creating an order on their own. Right, this constant competition should never be seen as anarchy, because if you study those contexts at a local, you realize there was a crystalline logic in everything they were doing, in terms of social, constructing these political territorial dominations. The use of violence itself was very sophisticatedly calibrated. Right, which doesn't mean that, of course, this system didn't produce kind of failures, that there weren't, martyrs, the knight errant, that was basically a brigand by definition, but it still happened within a, different spaces that are very articulated in terms of political, allegiances and interaction. So it's all much more logical and rational even than it seems, apparently. Naturally, the clergy was struggling on its own to carve its own special privileges and immunities, and they were especially the most supportive institution towards the public, the royal and imperial authority, exactly because they knew that with a strong central power, this even usurpation of the lands, this competition with the secular lords could be, let's say, more easily stamped, right? And the clergy remains generally, in fact, allied to the monarchy in this regard. But coming back on the definition of Miles, Flodoard is another French historian and naturally clergyman of the 10th century, distinguished neatly, for example, still between the princes and the milites. Richet, that have met before, wanted to address a character that was much less socially important than the princes, called him as coming ex-equestri ordine or de militari ordine, right? That are synonyms in this regard. So literally from the equestrian order / the military order, right? So equestrian, knight equal the military class. But the interesting thing is that the same author talks about ex equestri militari ordine, even when this character was a woman, for example. That is to say, I don't know, the wife of a knight. With this specification clarifying that at least in a certain exception, to be a miles in this regard corresponded rather to be part of a social status, right? Not to a professional condition. So here we are still in the mindset that after all there is a subordination of some sort. That if it's not exactly expressed, is somehow exemplified. I mean, evident in the social order and in the relative amount of power. But the first ecclesiastical thinkers that dedicated themselves to a true and proper functional distinction of society found themselves more consistently, especially from a linguistic and semantic point of view, in front of the problem of the condition of the Milites, right? Already the fathers of the church had proposed this primitive repartition of humanity in ordines, using this term in the meaning of an homogeneous group on the base of political social functions, let's say, or even professional attributions, or charismatic or corporative characteristics, right? According to what has been defined by Congar, for example, as a spiritual anthropology, and that was articulated in a descending hierarchy of perfection, right? That naturally, the social order of the Societas Christiana reflected the divine order in a hierarchical sense. That, for example, by Augustine was exemplified by three biblical characters such as Moses, Daniel, and Job, as symbols of three human types, respectively the contemplative one, the ecclesiastical one, and the one more absorbed by the earthly matters, right? And this was problematic because naturally the ancient sources spoke and reasoned through categories and examples that were very, very different from the 10th century society. Because in this perspective that we have just exemplified, for example, not even, for example, warriors, but not even kings themselves could have an important place in this Augustinian category. In fact, it's not an example that in the Augustinian biblical examples, the most political personality of the three was the one of Moses, right? That was actually the most contemplative of the three. So actually the furthest to contaminate himself with mundane affairs, and exactly for this reason the only apt to actually hold them without being carried away by themselves, right? So definitely a very, very different figure from kings at this time that were essentially knights on their own, and they lived as militarymen. That, and think about this, all the stigma that naturally was emphasized in this negative sense of the idea that there is a militia Christi, and that naturally Christianity at this point had already kind of blurred the boundaries for which violence was justified to defend society and all these things, but still shedding blood was a sin, right? So a person who dedicates himself to murder, that is basically one of the most serious crimes in absolute terms, is the most serious crimes, and wages war and raids and pillages and devastates and enslaves and then everything, can't be a contemplative figure like the one Augustine spotted in Moses, right? And for not talking about the Milites themselves, I mean, the king at least had this aura of wisdom, of greater, of hieratic authority, let's say, even naturally of divine legitimacy, in the monarchical mystics of the time. But for the Knights, it was very, very different from the Milites specifically. And it was almost unavoidable, in fact, in Christian society to recur to the old topos of the counterposition of the militia seculi compared to the militia Christi, right? To the servitium Dei. The thing here, consider we are just 1 century away from the Crusades, but the Christendom, even in the West, was very, very close. Still, in fact, before that, to the older, kind of, we can say, Orthodox models, right? It was, still consider, we made a video about this, that penance was a very serious thing, like atonement for Knights was something you find still at this very time is a very, very serious thing, even in the West, even if it was less than, at least namely, in the Byzantine world. But there was no, the variation in terms of moral difference, and physical violence per se was definitely condemned, right? So Agobert of Lyon, for example, that was a Spanish archbishop from the time of the Carolingian Renaissance, distinguished and counterposed with harshness the so-called secularis militia to the sacrum ministerium, right? So quite clearly what knights do for a living and what priests do for a living. And this was the Carolingian world that, to be honest, was, at least in their secular values, was absolutely, as violent and fond of bloodshed and of aristocratic, military-minded ethos as it could be, right? Even still somewhat superficially Christianized, even, right? Closer to more to Jewish mentality, actually. There was a much greater attraction by the Franks from the Old Testamentary Lord of Battles that the Christian, the Christian model itself, the evangelical Christ. So, but in the meanwhile, however, next to this tradition, there was another one that had started to affirm itself since the 8th century, and then eventually with greater decision since the 10th, that expressed a sociological anthropology that was well disposed to grant larger space and more benevolent consideration of the layman in the things of the world. That video on Gérald of Aurillac is very exemplary, because it's exactly that one, right? Basically, the typical 10th century lord, in all things, even as a military man, that is a saint at the same time, right? So there is the expansion of the idea relatively to the fact that, after all, the militia was not such a negative business by itself, was a negative profession, or even necessarily an inferior one, right? And there is a beautiful example that comes from Honorius of Autun, that is actually a much later theologian from the 12th century, and that it was very popular at the time, however, for whom, but the tradition stems fundamentally from this 10th century mentality of 2 centuries before, for which the post-flood humanity would have been split in essentially 3, ethnic stocks and social classes in this sense. This is very thought-provoking. The liberi, right, the descendants of Sem, the milites, the descendants of Japhet, and the serfs, the descendants of Cam, right? And naturally, this reflected in part the fact that the European, the Indo-Aryan populations were technically the milites, right? It was this kind of more warlike picture of the European, especially barbarian past, right? Whereas here the freemen are the Semites, right? And the Kamites are this kind of servile ethnicity. These were prejudices that existed in the anthropological interpretation of the Bible and all these things. And what is fascinating in Honorius of Autun is this neat distinction between the liberi and the milites, right? That stands, however, still apart from servitude, right? So the militia, right? So the military class, the milites, that are basically halfway between freemen and serfs. And for this reason, it's been believed actually that this system of Honorius of Autun, that however was older and already popular at the time, that might have origin in the imperial area, right? By that time, where more markedly, as we have seen, were the distances between the high and low feudality, and where the phenomenon of the milites of non-free condition was frequent, right? And there is a passage that is very interesting that comes from the chronicle of the Alsatian monastery of Ebersheim, the first author of which wrote in the first half of the 12th century, right? So in a moment where considered, now we'll talk about Barbarossa, so that was the one we properly introduced French feudalism in Germany, while the region was still basically within a vassalic, loosely feudal system, right? That had not taken root as much as in France. Well, Germany was still a fairly wild and untamed area that would have later transposed the legendary terms of the problems of the social stratification in the Holy Roman Germanic Empire, right? And this was a story that is naturally invented, but it's very fascinating, and that is actually, as we will see now, even was known in the imperial milieu, in which Julius Caesar, after his alliance with the Germans in order to defeat the Gauls, would have made of the German principes of senators, and of the minores milites citizens, right? So this is this idea of Romanization, in which, according to the chronicle, Caesar also included this solemn recommendation of the latter to the first. The text in Latin sounds: cum Iulius Caesar per decennium munificentia et benignitate atque honoribus omnes Germanos magis quam bello absque ornili tributo Romano subdidisset imperio et auxilio ipsorum senones Gallos aliasque circumpositas nationes vicisset benignitatem et fidem ipsorum erga se in hoc remuneravit, quod principes ipsorum senatores minores vero milites Romanos appellavit et conscripsit, deinde cum Romam redire disponeret conventum in Germania celebravit omnibusque valedicens, minores milites principus commendavit, ut non quasi servis ac famulis uterentur, sed quasi domini ac defensores ministeria ipsorum reciperent. Inde accidit quod praeter nationes ceteras Germani milites fiscales regni et ministeriales principum nuncupantur. Now, this is a beautiful passage. This is from the Chronicon Ebersheim-Mense, right? There is the version in the MGH Scriptores 23, page 432, that is a fantastic invention, right? Historiographical invention that basically, let's not translate them all, but this passage that is very fascinating when he says that not only Caesar basically made of these Germans that had helped them, that were already stratified, at the time, principes and minores milites, right? Roman citizens, right? So this is interesting because the Chronicle already identifies before Romanity, so in a German character, that there already were among the Germans the principes, right, that eventually become senators, and the lesser knights, right, the minores milites. So here there is, in a way, consider this is the first half of the 12th century. So there is always this realization that after the ministeriales, that are evidently these minores milites, are part of the political and social reality of Germany, and that become Roman. And naturally this is intended because the Germans were stressing naturally the fact that the Roman Empire now belonged to them, with the Germanic emperors, and it was becoming almost a proto-national pride, right? In which they wanted, however, to legitimize the Roman origin of it, because that was the truly imperial source, let's say. They were also saying that not only these guys became respectively Roman senators and citizens, right? And consider that the citizens are freemen, right? So it's kind of fascinating because it attributes the ministeriales, after all, an important status, right? Here it says, minores milites principibus commendavit. That is to say, that Caesar, here considered as, even if it was not the prototype of the imperial authority, is legitimizing in fact, the commendation proper, we could say, of this ministeriales to the principes, right? So these guys that are, I don't think here they're meant the princes of the greater princes of the empire, but at least, even yes, considering the system and not be fully formalized, but obviously the higher aristocracy of Germany, right? And in the Accidit, so it happened, quod praeter nationes ceteras Germani milites fiscales regni et ministeriales principum nunc cubantur. So here explains how since then there was this denomination for the milites fiscales, that is literally these troops that had to serve in virtue of their fiscal obligation, and the ministeriales as well, right? Of ministeriales principum. Right, so milites fiscales regni and ministeriales principum, that is the fiscal knights of the kingdom, and the ministeriales of the princes. That is also very fascinating because in here he had mentioned just the principes and the minores milites, and here he splits the thing in two in turn, because the principes here are basically intended as the kings and the other princes of Germany, and the minores milites as the milites fiscales and the ministeriales. So even in here, the milites fiscales are intended as the freemen that had to serve because of also their of their beneficia, right? So of this sort of tax, they're considered as a tax on base even of their wealth and how they have to serve on base of the land that being entrusted, right? So this is terrific, and this legendary Roman legacy, right, in the organization of the German medieval society, and also sheds light, frankly, on in particular on a declaration that Frederick Barbarossa made to the Romans, right? And that is in Rome, right? So always remember that the city of Rome and their citizens were part of the very important part of the process of legitimization of the German emperor, because without their acclamation, the crown, imperial crowning was not valid, right? So Otto Freisingen, that actually reports of this event, shows that Frederick knew, for example, about this legion. So this means that it was not just about the monastery of Ebersheim that was inventing it, but it was a voice, a legend, and an idea, a myth that circulated in Germany, according to which the Germans were the only and true heirs of ancient Rome in this regard. And this is naturally, Frederick probably would have not never addressed the Romans in these terms, but in this German national terms. But there was this let's say, pride that was naturally associated, since the idea that back in the day the Roman authority had somewhat legitimized the Roman emperors, and it's very the German emperors, right, as such, which naturally is a bit more complicated than this, but it was interpreted by the Germans like this, and this is very fascinating, right, because it also hides and it doesn't rationalize it, but it actually explains also how these peoples had seen the way they had come to rule over the former lands of the empire, in the sense that it was a more eminently religious and military ideal that the legalistic and institutional mechanism that the Byzantines, for example, this time were stressing, but also sheds light on the awareness that, at least in this area of Germany, because Alsace was Germany, of course, at this time, had regarding the somewhat ancestral origins of the ministerialist knighthood, right? Now, coming back, I would conclude it here, because there would be more to say, but talking about the sociological scheme proposed by Honoris of Autun, as we've seen, well, it didn't have a great deal of success, right? First of all, it didn't include, as we've seen, he basically associated the peoples to the fundamentally to their actual origin, to their occupation. It was too broad, like it didn't take in consideration the clergy, by the way, which is even more fascinating, because it's somewhat an ecclesiastical source that, however, essentially displays a secular view of social segmentation that also speaks for, in fact, probably a more secular. It really comes from the areas of the empire, because that's also the place where the same ecclesiastical princes were somewhat more secular in lifestyle, right? So where the military aspect of the story was more at the center of the political institutional balances. The archbishops had armies of even thousands of knights. There was it was normal that essentially the secular and ecclesiastical princes would live like that. But it was a too particular social model to be spread in the rest of Europe, where, by the way, this dialectic between freedom and non-freedom of the knights didn't fit, right? At this time in France, it wasn't like that. The Milites was a chevalier, point. There was no distinction at that point with freeman, non-freeman. That was just a German thing, a Lorrainese thing, right? And in fact, eventually the tripartition that was destined to become classical was instead the one of the Miracula Sancti Bertini, which there are the oratores, so the clergy, the bellatores, that is the fighter warriors, and the imbelle vulgus, right? So even in here there is the military touch of it, because it says imbellis, that is cowardly, fearful, but properly non-warlike people, right? This amount of common people, of plebs, right? That was fixed. Especially within the lines established by Adalberon of Laon in the three orders of the clerici, the Milites and the Laboratores, the Oratores bellatores and laboratores, you know, all of that stuff. But this is just for saying how different areas of Europe in this central centuries of the Middle Ages were essentially reasoning through really different paradigms relatively to many aspects of their politics and society, and in this case of the identity of the military class as such, right? And I find it very fascinating, and this can easily go in parallel with other videos we made. We'll keep talking about medieval knighthood in these terms, but let's say that for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.